So this recording is going to focus on questionnaire design, but this is just to give you a brief overview. If you're designing a questionnaire, you also should look at 3 other videos that I'm preparing. One is on measurement scales, the other one is on designing and planning a questionnaire, and the third one is on questionnaire administration. I've broken them down because otherwise this would be a rather long recording. So first of all, a questionnaire is actually a quantitative approach. Sometimes some students can mistake it for a qualitative approach and sort of say, well, I'm using open-ended questions, it's qualitative. Well, there you're probably, really talking about an interview, and it probably shouldn't be used in that kind of format. So you might want to kind of rethink what you're doing if you were using a questionnaire as a qualitative tool, because actually it's a very quantitative tool, and that's what its main purpose is. That's not to say you can't ask open-ended questions, but you need to use them with care. So essentially it's a very structured research instrument, and it typically collects data about people, their behaviour, attitudes and motivations, but could include other materials. So the types of information we typically get are things about the respondent characteristics, so the people who've completed our questionnaire. Who are they? What age group are they? How much do they earn? What's their education level? All of these kind of things. We quite often want to capture this kind of information about who's completed the questionnaire. If nothing else, we might want to compare it to national statistics or some other statistics we have to see how representative our sample is. Then another category of data we might collect is on activities and behaviour. So what people are doing, or what have they done? This is very usefully collected by a questionnaire. And then the third category there is attitudes and motivation. So more of a kind of why. So what are their attitudes to going swimming in the sea? What are people's attitudes to fishing? Can be a bit contentious for some people. It's that kind of thing. So we're getting a kind of understanding of the way people think and feel about things, and questionnaires are very good at capturing that. Now, these 3 things, they aren't exclusive. There's other things you might do with a questionnaire, but these are some of the main kinds of things we do with a questionnaire. Now, if you're thinking about just laying out a questionnaire, this will differ quite dramatically between something which is self-completed and one which is interview administered. So if you're designing a questionnaire that's going to be self-completed, which tends to be the main form of questionnaire used these days, you need to have quite a clear and careful layout for people to be able to complete it. And a lot of questionnaires are now completed online, and I will talk about that more in the questionnaire administration recording. And these use tools which actually can set out the questionnaire for you and sort of to some extent solves the problems, but still needs some thought. But if you're going to give out a paper-based questionnaire for self-completion, it needs quite a bit of care and attention paid to the layout. So things you all need to think about anyway is the title, so whether it's online or face-to-face or being given out to people as a paper-based copy. The title and the introduction are important, because it needs to be important to the people completing it. And we need to include some critical information in the introduction about what the research is about, who the research is for, what it's being used for, who you are as the researcher, and sort of issues to do with confidentiality of the data. They're quite important, and that will also be something when you do your research ethics submission that you will need to cover. And there is some standardised wording that needs to go in there that's very important. You need to think about font size and the style of font. I found that when you're doing research on site with people and you give out a questionnaire for people to complete, the text needs to be fairly large because some people might have forgotten their glasses, their eyesight might not be great, don't make it too small and difficult for people to do. And also think about things like the use of space on the page and that it's sort of obvious where people go to the next question. So have very clear instructions. And at the bottom there I've mentioned routing questions. So sometimes you ask a question and that means that the answer to that question means that people can't answer some of the subsequent questions. So then you need to tell people where to go. And if it's self-completed and paper-based, you need to then say, if you answered no to this question, please go to question 6 and make it very clear. If you do it online, this can happen automatically. which is a huge advantage. And then we've got this dilemma of open versus closed questions. So generally in a questionnaire, we want to focus on closed questions. Now, the reason being is it's a quantitative tool, and we want to be able to readily capture data, quantify it, and we want to be able to do some analysis that probably compares different questions. And that's much easier to do if you use closed questions. It's also much quicker for people to complete, said there. Much easier for coding, for analysis, and you're likely to get more people complete your questionnaire. People are very bad at completing open questions. It's much easier for people to understand the questions because the answer options, if they didn't quite understand the question, the answer options will help them. And it's much easier when you're asking personal, sensitive questions. Now, questions which people are quite sensitive about are things like their income. And if you have a closed question which gives people some answer options, so, you sort of say, what is your household income? And then this is in bands like, £12,000 to £20,000, etc. It's much easier. People just tick the box, whereas they don't actually like that as an open question. Similar with age. People are much happier to tick an age category than to put their actual age in. But the problem with closed questions is it does limit the answer options, and sometimes we don't know what those answer options might be, which is where open questions come in. And the advantages there is people can use their own words, so, if you want to actually capture something about people's thinking, their feelings, what they liked most about a place. So, for instance, if you're doing research on in tourism on a destination or an activity, that can be quite helpful. What features of the place did you enjoy most? And then people can put their own words in. There it can be very helpful, and you can actually get a bit more depth and detail to the data collection. And also you don't bias the answers by actually putting in a range of answer options that constrain your respondents. But the challenges are it's much slower to complete, it's very difficult to code. So with that example of what did you enjoy at the destination, people will often talk about the same things but write it in a different way, and then it's a bit unclear about how you might code that. So that's really challenging, and you may end up with loads of different answer options, and you can't really do much with it apart from just note that actually what people enjoyed at the destination was very varied. You can also find that people misunderstand the question. People don't read things very clearly, and therefore they give you odd answers which don't quite make sense. And the biggest problem, I think, is that open questions are often not answered because people can't be bothered. They're doing a questionnaire. It takes time to actually type in an answer, and especially with self-complete ones, you often get gaps in your data there, and that can be a problem. So generally we want to use closed questions, but open questions can strategically be quite useful in places, but do need a bit of thought about what you might do with the answers. In terms of some question wording issues now I'll cover, try to avoid being vague. So, often you'll see on questionnaires terms like usually, regularly, frequently, occasionally. These are quite vague when you think about what they mean. So I've got the example there. Which newspaper do you read regularly? Okay, so you're immediately thinking, well, okay, so I read The Guardian. Do I read that regularly? Oh, I'm not really sure. But then, which newspaper have you read in the last 7 days? Well, that's a bit clearer. I can say, oh yes, I've read The Guardian in the last 7 days. But then, actually, if you get really specific, what does read mean? I haven't read all of it. I've just looked at it a bit. So there's another question, one at the bottom. Which newspaper have you read or looked at for at least 2 minutes in the last 7 days? Now, that's probably far too specific. But you get the point, really, that actually we're trying to measure something carefully. So we want to take out as much vagueness as possible without it getting silly. And then we need to use appropriate timeframes for questions. So I've got one here. How many times have you been on holiday? Oh gosh, do they mean in my lifetime? That's probably quite a lot. So actually try to give people appropriate timeframes. How many times you've been on holiday in the last 12 months? Most people are going to be able to remember that. So that's sort of helpful for people. They might remember their holidays over the last 3 years, but any longer than that, and I probably wouldn't have a clue. So, you need to think about appropriate timeframes. And avoid asking respondents to estimate or calculate their response. So again, going back to that, how often do you read the Daily Mail? Unless there's clear answer options for them, they don't really know how to say, well, I read I read it quite often. Maybe, it's difficult to say. So again, how many times have you read the Daily Mail in the last 7 days? And that gives you a much stronger reporting of that. And then there's hypothetical questions. So what festivals do you intend to attend in the next 3 years? Okay, so you're getting people to think in the future of what they might do. Sometimes we have to ask these questions because we do want to know this, but they are problematic because people will go, oh yes, I'm planning to attend Glastonbury and I want to go to Boomtown and maybe Reading Festival. But it's actually much better if you want to know about people's festival going behaviour, ask them what they have attended in the past. So which festivals have you attended in the last 3 years? That's much better. So if you don't actually need to look into the future, ask them what they have done. And ask only one thing at a time. I see this quite often when I look at students' questionnaires. So here's an example where someone's asked about visiting the cinema and the theatre. They're different things. There should be 2 different questions. And avoid double negatives. So yeah, I don't even know what my answer would be to this. Do you not agree that smoking should not be allowed in the workplace? This is for those of us who are English speakers as our native language, we often talk like this. Actually, I don't know what the answer to that question is because it's too confusing. This would probably be less of an issue for someone who's using English as a second language because you probably wouldn't write something as complicated as this. But this is how we talk. And of course, sometimes we write down how we talk. Then avoid things like jargon, IT, PC. These might not mean anything for somebody else. So when you're used to jargon and abbreviations, other people might not be. And another thing in terms of, not really wording, but you can use pictures too. We've very successfully used cartoon images in questionnaires and asked people that presented a concept to people and then asked people to respond to that concept. Pilot surveys are very important. So unlike qualitative research, where we often don't undertake any kind of pilot work because the process is so iterative, with a questionnaire, once your questionnaire is being distributed to people, you can't change it. So it's no good after getting some of your responses back and going, oh gosh, that doesn't work, or oh, I wish I'd asked such and such. You need to get it right before you do your main study. And so we do pilot surveys, and these do help enable us to do all these things like test the question wording. Hopefully you'll pick up if something doesn't make sense because someone will tell you. We can review a list of pre-coded answers. So if a lot of people are ticking other, then you know that perhaps you need some other answer options. And often you can sometimes devise some pre-coded answer options by having an open question in your pilot. So if you don't know what the answer options are going to be, perhaps put an open question in your pilot and find out what options there might be. You can test the sequence of questions, make sure it actually works in a logical flow, and you can test how long the questionnaire takes to complete. Because for instance, when you do your information to respondents at the start of a questionnaire, you need to tell them how much time it's going to take them. And by doing a pilot survey, you can find that out. You can test any aspects of the fieldwork procedure. So if you're giving out questionnaires on site, make sure that kind of works and how that's going to proceed. I go as far as coding responses and actually checking the data can be analysed. And I encourage students to think about that as well. So if I do a pilot survey, typically my pilot will be 100 questionnaires. Now that's much larger than I would expect a student to use. But that's because I want to really carefully test the data analysis is going to work. And then in my main study, I might be collecting as many as 600 questionnaires. And therefore, I want to make sure it's really right before I do that. Then other things you can check are things like the response rate. Are you getting enough responses back? Does the sampling process work? And also if you've got some kind of measurement scales, and I'll talk about measurement scales in another session, whether they need refining in some some form. So these are quite significant. Okay, so now you need to, if you're doing a questionnaire, you need to go and watch some of the other videos on doing questionnaires, and that will fill in some gaps for you. So there's one on measurement scales, one on designing and planning questionnaire, and one on questionnaire administration.